He ate T-bone steaks, he lifted barbell plates, he was sweeter than a German chocolate shake, he made your back crack, your liver quiver, he was the reflection of perfection, the #1 selection, he was the ladies' pet, the men's regret, he defined what a superstar in professional wrestling / sports entertainment would be for years to come. He was superstar Billy Graham. You also have to wonder what would have happened had they kept the WWF Championship on him just a little bit longer with Big Graham. But yes, let's talk about the life of superstar Billy Graham, as I'm John Retlam with a career retrospective on superstar Billy Graham, who passed away yesterday at the age of 79, mere weeks before his 80th birthday. And yeah, let me know your favorite superstar Billy Graham moments in the comments, please. I have made it clear that I was not necessarily a fan of the person superstar Billy Graham, and I will say why in due course, but there's no denying that even if you didn't care for the guy, he was influential. He was influential as fuck. There would be no Hulk Hogan. There would be no Jesse Ventura. Triple H said that he was a big influence on why he got into wrestling. Rock talked about him. Various people borrowed, and in the case of Hulk Hogan and even Jesse Ventura, pretty much stole everything from him, in all honesty. But it's not like Billy Graham was ever bitter about that. No. Oh, why would you say that? Yeah, this is going to be as open and honest as I possibly can be, because as a fan, I can appreciate what he accomplished in his career while also recognizing that, let's just say this much, this guy was very much the type of person, if you were on his good side and you did everything that he wanted because he was the one that fucked up his life quite a bit, then you were golden. And if you decide to actually have, your head not in your goddamn ass and realize, hey, wait a second, he's just using me, then yeah, he really didn't have any time for you. He also decided to utilize religion to justify his bigotry and hatred for certain people. Comments about Kofi Kingston in particular, but let's start at the beginning, and when we get to the end, we'll stop, as our Lord and Savior, the Mad Hatter, once said. So, he was born on June 7, 1943 in Phoenix, Arizona. And there was no doubt that he would, and you saw some of this on his, biography or the documentary WWE did, 20 years too soon. I mean, 20 years too soon, I guess. I guess. Like, I don't know. I mean, he no doubt influenced people. If he hadn't been in wrestling, especially for U.S. wrestling, it would have been drastically different. There would have been no Hulk Hogan. There wouldn't have been a lot of people. Because his physical and verbal charisma drew people in. It made them realize, hey, that's what I want to do. And there were a lot of people that did it better. Because they could work. Unlike Billy Graham. Anyway, bodybuilding career. I mean, started early in life. So did steroid abuse. And I'm just going to say right now that plenty of people in bodybuilding, in wrestling, did steroids. Especially in the 70s and 80s. My God, the 80s was rampant. It was insane. And it wasn't just wrestling, but strictly focusing on wrestling here. It was nuts. He won Mr. Teenage America in 1961 because I believe he just turned 18. And he had bopped around doing stuff. He had done, bouncing at some clubs in New York City, Phoenix, and L.A. From New York to L.A., L.A. to New York City. Bouncing around a lot of clubs in the NYC. Okay, I really can't do that song too well, but he even tried to have a stint in the CFL in 66, 67. And he was already in his mid-20s by this point. And had been using steroids well before he got into wrestling. Again, he wasn't the only one, but he did that stuff. He was on magazine covers. He did a shoot with Arnold Schwarzenegger. You got to be really careful how you say that. And he could bench press 605 pounds, which is impressive. I mean, you need to have the genetics, basically, to be able to do that. Because steroids can help you, but you got to have that ability to do that. And they just enhance what you can do. His stint in the CFL, didn't last all that long. I almost said stint in the XFL. That would have been goddamn hilarious to see him at his age, with his hip being goddamn mulch and his body being mulch, trying to be in the XFL. Imagine if they had the XFL back in the 60s and 70s. He kept doing, he would do some bodybuilding, but he would mostly do weightlifting training during his wrestling career. He was always hovering around 270, 275. he was pretty cut. I mean, especially for back then. I mean, it's not that there weren't wrestlers and athletes that weren't cut, but he helped, establish the mold, break the mold. And then he ballooned up to like 325, like by 1980, 81. I mean, I remember like seeing footage. I mean, obviously you didn't. Obviously, like I wasn't born in 1980, I was born in 81. I didn't get into wrestling until 85 with War to Sell the Score. So I remember hearing about superstar Billy Graham. You hear from kids you talk to at school about it, but it's like, oh, my brother saw him, older brother, and you hear this stuff, and whether it's true or not, you see the fact that superstar Billy Graham was a big goddamn deal. They would show pictures of him. I mean, and then but by the time he got back to the WWF for his third stint, well, his second stint in WWF, technically, I guess his fourth stint, he was a little bit trimmer, but not by much. I mean, he still, for his body and the state of him and the fact that he was in his mid-40s by that point, or at least his early 40s, he really should have been a lot trimmer. Nevertheless, he was trained by Stu Hart. I can only imagine how much fun Stu Hart had torturing this muscle head. I can only imagine how much fun he had. Wrestled in Calgary, made his debut in early January of 1970. And if you think about it, his full-time career really only lasted like 15 years because he bopped around after around 1980. He would cool off for a little bit, and he would make more sporadic appearances after coming back he wrestled a bit in 81, 82, that kind of stuff. But his full-time career really was only about 15 years, if that, because injuries and all that. Now, there was an Arizona-based promotion. He also wrestled in L.A., Mike LaBelle, the one that Vince screwed over on a TV deal. Read up more on that. He adopted the Billy Graham name as a tribute to the televangelist, that noted piece of shit and everything. And funny that this Billy Graham would also use religion to justify his hatred. And in Florida, the Graham name was kind of to go along with, being a kayfabe brother of Luke and Eddie Graham, who Eddie Graham owned the Florida territory. He decided to incorporate the arm wrestling aspect, because he had the 22-inch pythons, and also weightlifting stuff. Now, that was a good idea to mask the fact that he couldn't fucking work to save his goddamn life. I mean, go back and watch Graham. He had that physical charisma. He had that ability, like, oh, no, I'm in this, or you got the bear hug, but he couldn't work to save his life. I mean, good God, watch him take bumps from Backlund. He took that atomic drop, and Backlund would have been better off just sitting him on the goddamn ground for how little he got off the ground for the move, but I digress again. The arm wrestling champion of the world might be the arm wrestling champion of the universe. There might be life on Mars. There might be Martians, and I'll beat them up there too because he was very good at verbalizing stuff that he couldn't really pull off, but he was great. He was great at verbalizing. There's no doubt about that. Debuted in the AWA in early October of 1972. Feud with Wahoo McDaniel and others. I mean, there's a long list and everything. You can check Wiki, you can check other stuff. And the Wahoo feud, I've seen a little bit of tape of. There was stuff floating around on YouTube. And look, Wahoo at that point, was pretty goddamn good. I mean, by the time it got to the late 80s and he was in the AWA, but Wahoo was tremendous as far as being super over wherever he went. Carolinas, AWA, he was great. He was great. And you could see Wahoo being able to work with superstar Billy Graham, who was only in the first couple years of his career at this point. And the weightlifting, the arm wrestling stuff, he would do the arm wrestling thing where they have an arm wrestling contest. He'd find a way to duck out of it, like, oh, the babyface is going to win, and he'd do something, and it would lead to a match later in the card. Did that with Andre in Texas 77? 6? 7? Something like that. It was somewhere around that. Because, you hear about programs and you see some stuff floating around on the internet. And went on the IWA, tours of Japan. International Wrestling Alliance, I want to say is what it was. Super wide series. I don't know why that made me laugh so goddamn much. Probably because I'm immature. He went to Dallas. There was a brass knuckles championship where punches were legal because you couldn't use closed fists. That's one thing longtime fans may remember about Jesse Ventura pulling out, always using a closed fist. And Ventura was great as far as that. Speaking of somebody that abused steroids and also was maybe not necessarily the most amenable guy backstage, but he was a hell of a commentator. Not a great wrestler, but a hell of a commentator. He did work in the Carolinas briefly when Flair had his back injury, and that makes sense. You take a look at Flair. Flair was dropping some weight at this point, but after his back injury, he really would drop weight, which made sense, and that's why he took bumps weird, because of his back. And Graham, you could see, just based on physical charisma alone, maybe not work great, because even though they were going a little more sports entertainment type at that point with George Scott as the booker, Graham fit that perfectly. And then he went to the WWF in 75 and parts of 76. He was managed by the Grand Wizard. No, not a guy dressed in a Klan outfit. Just want to say, Google the Grand Wizard, WWF. He was great. Ernie Roth, I believe was his name, if I remember right. I might be screwing that name up. I apologize if I am. He feuded with Ivan Putski. Graham, not Ernie Roth. That would have been weird. But basically, he feuded with Ivan Putski, and that would be something that actually would come back into play later during his run. And Ivan Putski, you want to talk about somebody that was a great power lifter and also a steroid user. I mean, just look at him. Same with his son, Scott. Again, not knocking, but you look back on wrestling, you're like, holy shit. Anyway, so stints in Houston, in Florida, St. Louis. He even worked in Hawaii. He was still doing occasional trips to Japan. And then he returned to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. This is when Vince Sr. had it, when Vince Jr. was an announcer. He was trying to get some more influence because he saw the potential of superstar Billy Graham. Bruno said basically, I was supposed to only have the championship for a little bit after Stasiak beat Pedro. And Stan Stasiak, by the way, father of Sean Stasiak, yes, meet, and the guy that they made a bumbling fool, Planet Stasiak, and was running in the Kurt Angle's milk truck. Why they made Sean Stasiak, even though he did blow the whole thing about the deal with his, the invasion happening at WrestleMania 70. I don't know why they would punish him for that. They've taken back people who said far worse, Warrior. But nevertheless, Bruno beat Stan Stasiak, held the championship again for 3.5, almost 4 years, and was like, okay, I'm done. Please, I'm done. And in Baltimore, Maryland, on April 30th, 1977, Billy Graham, using nefarious means, wins the championship. Oh my goodness. And superstar Billy Graham, as far as physical charisma and verbal charisma and the ability to draw people in and get people to hate him, he bled, he sweat, he was even part of that wrestler movie that Vern did, I believe, in 74? 73, 74? I need to watch that at some point. But by this point, he was pretty goddamn... I mean, he was over in the AWA and he was over in other areas as long as you didn't see him all that much. Now, granted, it didn't rely as much on in-ring work, but he was lousy. He was really lousy. You go back and watch some of this stuff. His feud with Dusty in particular... Because Dusty could work. I mean, was Dusty the absolute best ring general? He was a pretty damn good ring general. He wasn't always the best worker, but he had the physical charisma. He had the fire with the elbows. And watching those 3 matches, yes, they had dodgy finishes. You had the Texas Bull Rope match. You had this stuff. But the series of matches before he lost the championship, Graham, that is, not Dusty, because they took the title away from Cody's father and the Garden Daddy. Him and, Dusty had an incredible series of matches there. He also was at an Orange Bowl show in early 78 where he faced off against Harley Race in a 1-hour time limit draw, which must have been... Harley Race must have been ready to pull his hair out doing that. He couldn't have pulled Graham's hair out because Graham was already losing his hair by this point because Graham was approaching 35 and had abused steroids, had gotten into wrestling late. The roids, while they helped, had started to stretch his muscles and tear them and everything and this kind of stuff because the human body isn't meant to take that shit. And Vince Sr. came to an agreement with Bob Backlund to bring him in because he gave Graham the start date for his reign and the end date. In hindsight, even though he only held it for 9.5 months, as much as I don't care for Billy Graham, as if that isn't obvious here, he absolutely deserved to hold the title a little bit longer. And I love Bob Backlund. Mr. Backlund was tremendous. Honestly, Bob Backlund should have won the championship sometime in later 78. They probably should have turned Graham babyface and maybe done something he suggested, I believe, Ivan Koloff, because Koloff was part of the company. I believe it was Koloff, Ladd, and Graham. They were like the top three heels, and they all got paid the same. That was a story told by Cornette and Brian Last on their podcast. And it's backed up with research and payoffs and everything. Graham wanted to turn face because he was really starting to get some attention. That feud with Dusty in particular, but even with Ivan Putski, people were starting to gravitate to him. Not just the New York audience, the Northeast audience in general, or audiences. But Vince Sr. would not relent. He wouldn't go back on his word, even though Backlund, I think, could have been just fine doing stuff in the company for a bit and then building up to facing Graham. And if you wanted to have face versus face, and Graham got all pissed off after having him around as a face, that would have been fine. But no, he lost it on February 20th, 1978. And then Graham kind of became disillusioned. I mean, Graham by this point was breaking down, like, significantly. You could take a look at him. He was not moving all that well. And this is before he lost the championship. So maybe, probably wasn't the worst thing in the world they took it off of him. But for box office, he was drawing. He was drawing serious money. He left in December of 78, bopped around Houston, Cali, Florida, IWA, Japan. Stopped wrestling in May of 1980. Placed 7th in the World's Strongest Man competition, and then decided I'm going to shave my head, because I want to get rid of the superstar gimmick. It was also because he was fucking going bald from all the steroid abuse. He had met his wife Valerie, at this point his second wife, because he had 2 children from a previous wife. Years of steroid abuse made him sterile, so he couldn't give her children. I believe that's the story that went around. I don't, because she wanted children. And yeah, he had children from a previous marriage. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't have a clue. I don't really care. I don't wish them ill. But Billy Graham had admitted this and even wanted his wife to help him inject steroids into his body and do all this stuff. So he was breaking down significantly, quickly. He stopped wrestling for almost 2 years. I mean, he made some appearances in 81. The karate gimmick, though, he's doing this. Gorilla Monsoon put out the story that Superstar had died, and then it turned out he was very much alive, and Gorilla refused to retract that. I wonder if that story ever came up when Gorilla and Superstar Billy Graham were doing commentary like at SummerSlam 88. Yes, Superstar Billy Graham did color at SummerSlam 88. I believe he even was on the call for the Ultimate Warrior squashing Honky Tonk Man. So, he made a return to the now WWF in August of 82. He was the one that destroyed the championship, and Backlund was crying, and that's when the fans started to turn on him. Also Snuka. If only they knew that Snuka would murder his girlfriend about less than a year later. And he left in April of 83. Graham, not Snuka, because Snuka was still part of the company. He couldn't beat Backlund for the title. I mean, at that point, Graham was approaching 40. Well, actually, let's see. By the time he would have been 40. Or just closing to it. He returned to the AWA, Florida. He had a feud with Jimmy Valiant and started finally he got rid of the karate gimmick, that devil karate gimmick, as he called it, because he's such a religious nut. He ended up getting the Superstar tie-dye thing, that kind of stuff. He had a hip replacement in June of 86, made a return to full-time schedule in like mid-87, and basically One Man Gang had to injure him because he was basically toast. His hip was mulch, and also the fact that about 46 years old, he had bones of a 66-year-old. Like, he was toast. The roid abuse had caught up, but also the fact he did not condition himself well at all. He was made for show, not go. And you could see that even in his AWA stuff, even in his stuff with Dusty. Even though he could do, he could do a few things, he couldn't do all that much. And then he managed Don Morocco into 88, even at Mania 4. No, really, they tried turning Don Morocco face. You know how well that worked? It didn't. It didn't. And I love Don Morocco. Hell of a talent. But he worked as a commentator. And then we get the bopping around. He had the disputes with Vince McMahon. And then got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2004. Sold his Hall of Fame ring later to get anti-rejection meds for his new liver. And more on that in a bit. Occasional appearances, even had an on-screen storyline with Jonathan Coachman where he would end up knocking him out. Bet he enjoyed knocking out a black man. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. And he signed a Legends contract in 2015 and a new one in 2021, yet he was always bitter and always talking about how he lectured young athletes about the dangers of steroids, yet would say stuff like Kofi Kingston or Adam Cole, baby, or various people would need to take steroids to look better. When steroids ruined his goddamn life, ruined his goddamn marriage, even though I believe he was still married to Valerie until his death. Boy, I bet that lady felt bad about all the years she wasted with that goddamn pile of shit. Yeah, this is where things are going to get goddamn vicious, at least for a little bit. Because while I recognize the box office and the great influential individual that Superstar Billy Graham was, do not try to even kid yourselves. This guy was a goddamn cesspool. He was a fucking cesspool. Got a liver transplant in 2002 with from a young lady. Her parents had decided to make her an organ donor because I believe she was brain dead from a car accident. I don't remember all the details. And then he had more medical issues. He was having cirrhosis of the liver, possibly from steroid abuse and all the other stuff that he did and everything, and the fact that he didn't want to take care of himself. He got a new lease on life and proceeded to be the goddamn poisonous, toxic individual that most people are when they let religion poison their body. I'm just saying that right now. If you're a good person that uses religion for the right reasons to be a good person and everything, good for you. If you're anything like Billy Graham, you're a moron. He was... Here's the thing that made me... The steroid trial. By the way, the Dark Side of the Ring episode on the steroid trial, besides Jerry McDivitt, I don't think anybody really was a good talking head on that. But he had sued Dr. Zahorian and also WWF saying, oh, they made me and forced me to take steroids to maintain my position in the company. He was already using them from a teenage age, or at least soon after his teenage years, through his bodybuilding phase, into the CFL, into his wrestling company, or into his wrestling career, well before he got into WWF. And then the Phil Donahue appearance. You know, the one about where they said that Pat Patterson, Terry Garvin, and various other people had abused ring boys. Billy Graham says that he saw abuse, but then later retracted that. Basically, he wanted to extort money from Vince. Now, I'm not saying that Billy Graham did or didn't see this stuff. I don't know if I necessarily believe a shyster like him, but that being said, where there's smoke, there's fire. Mel Phillips. Google Mel Phillips, kid. Terry Garvin. Google Terry Garvin. And just listen to a Roddy Piper clip about Pat Patterson. Look at Piper and you tell me that Patterson didn't do something. Even though I saw the extended clip and it wasn't anything sexual, well, maybe he was covering that. And maybe he didn't do that to Piper, but while I maybe not believe that Graham saw that, I'm sure there was plenty of shit. And Vince tried everything he could to sweep this under the goddamn rug. I've seen that Phil Donahue thing. The whole Phil Donahue. You could do Phil Donahue, WWF 1992. I forget the exact search thing. Look at that. Look at that and tell me that Vince doesn't have guilt written all over his face. Also, Meltzer has a hell of a goddamn mullet on that. But, you know, he's like, oh, he just wanted to extort money from them. He spoke out about how Linda had distanced herself from WWE's racist or racy program. Well, racist programming too. Because Vince dropped the N-word in front of Booker T, which Billy Graham probably cheered. But then the 2010 Senate campaign, where Linda just basically set fire to piles of money, running for Senate twice and losing badly, which is good for that lazy-eyed, stupid twat. And she deserved that. She deserved every bit of that, by the way. And then this is where I really started to have issues with Billy Graham. Remember how Dusty passed away suddenly? It was like mid-June of 2015. And he'd been running creative in NXT. Mere weeks later, Billy Graham's like, hey, I should get that spot. Fans called him out, and other people called him out for basically being somebody that was just pouncing on somebody and not respecting Dusty. Dusty, by the way, somebody that helped make Superstar in the eyes of many fans in the company. And all over the world. Because there were people that saw that stuff. Now, yes, VHS, beta, that kind of stuff, that wasn't necessarily known. But or that wasn't necessarily distributed, but people would see film of it. People would find a way to flock to their televisions to see if they could get a broadcast of it, and people were captivated by it, because you'd be captivated by Dusty at that point and Billy Graham creating magic in the goddamn ring. But no, let's just basically say that I had these great ideas. Like I've said even in the past that I've spoken out about steroid use affecting me, but you guys need to take them because that's the only way you're going to get over. No, see, Billy, people actually had talent unlike you. You had verbal talent. You didn't have physical talent. You had physical charisma. You couldn't bump for goddamn shit. You were terrible. The stuff in Memphis, I've seen some of the stuff that he had against Lawler, matches and other stuff. He was rotten. He was rotten in the goddamn ring. And the reason that I'm basically just doing this whole thing is to talk about the fact that, yes, he had positives to his career. Of course he did. You can't look at somebody like him and see that there's no way that there wasn't a massive influence from over here bleeding over to other wrestlers. But Superstar Billy Graham was not a good person. And he tried to push himself as a good person. Oh, that, I'm this, and it was all everybody against me. And yeah, maybe there were people that could have treated him a little better in the company. But also at the same time, he was lucky he got the spot that he did. And sure, they should have made him champion a little bit longer, but he was already breaking down, so maybe it's a good thing they didn't. And considering he fucking self-destructed really quickly, the stuff in Memphis in 79 was terrible. And that was a year and change, and he just basically said, I'm not going to work out, I'm not going to do this, I'm just going to balloon up, and then I'm going to do this stuff, and it's everybody else's fault but mine. If he never took personal responsibility. He never did. I don't believe for a second in any interviews that he did with WWE that he actually took personal responsibility. It was a way for him to babyface himself, because all he wanted to do was just get more money, because he blew through all his money because he kept abusing steroids to the point he needed a new liver that he didn't fucking deserve. And a guy that was so influential ended up basically, practically, immobile. And I couldn't have thought of a better fucking way for a piece of shit like that to end. So yeah, great influential talent. Rest in hell, bitch. So yeah, what's your favorite Superstar Billy Graham moment? Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Riplin, and I don't give a shit if this pisses people off. I'll see you soon.